Hi, my name is Jason, and this is the Historical Cinematic Universe. In Patrick Williams' original video on historical cinematic universes, he talked about how there are certain clusters of films that fit together with the same time period and setting, featuring recurring characters and overlapping stories. I would call these clusters narrative arcs, and the greater historical cinematic universe is full of them. The United States Space Program Cinematic Universe is a narrative arc. So is the Washington Post-Nixon administration cinematic universe, though I would say that it's part of a larger arc about the Watergate scandal. I even started the greater historical cinematic universe listing the movies and shows that were part of the American Revolution arc. There is even a collection of stories that create a nearly unbroken narrative arc that spans almost the entire timeline of the greater HCU. It is the films and shows that feature the kings and queens of the English and British monarchy, from Henry I to Charles III. I call it the Greater Crown, after the popular Netflix show The Crown, since these stories can be viewed as an extension of that series. There are over 200 stories in this arc, and with a couple of exceptions, it includes stories that feature at least two monarchs in such a way that you can link the stories together from the Middle Ages to the modern day. Now, listing every story in the Greater Crown would take some time. So instead, here is a very abridged list featuring the most monarchs and the least stories. The Pillars of the Earth is a 2010 miniseries based on Ken Follett's novel of the same name. It is about a bunch of fictional people in a fictional town building a fictional cathedral. However, it is set during a historical period known as the Anarchy, and does feature several historical characters, including Henry I, King Stephen, Empress Matilda, and Henry II. It is important to note that Matilda's reign is disputed. However, I am including disputed monarchs in this list. The Devil's Crown from 1978 is a BBC series about the rise of the Plantagenets. It features King Stephen, Empress Matilda, Henry II, Henry the Young King, Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart, King John, and Henry III. The 1984 adaptation of William Shakespeare's The Life and Death of King John has King John, Henry III, and the disputed Louis the Lion, who, during the First Barons' War, ruled part of England for over a year before surrendering his claim and eventually becoming King Louis VIII of France. The next three stories have simple father-son successions. The 1975 episode of Churchill's People on the Anvil about the Second Barons' War features Henry III and the future Edward I, also known as Edward Longshanks. Outlaw King, a 2018 historical war drama from Netflix, about Scottish King Robert the Bruce in his fight against the English, and like Braveheart has Edward I and the future Edward II. And the 1970 adaptation of Christopher Marlowe's Edward II, with Edward II and Edward III. Here we have our first break in the Greater Crown, as I have yet to find a story featuring Edward III and his eventual successor, Richard II. Fortunately, there is a way to connect the two monarchs, with two princes, Edward the Black Prince and his brother John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Both were sons of Edward III, and fathers to future English kings, Richard II and Henry IV respectively. First, Edward III and Edward the Black Prince appear together in The Dark Avenger, the 1955 adventure film starring Errol Flynn. Next, Edward the Black Prince and John of Gaunt appear together in Peter I the Cruel, a 1989 Spanish series about Peter I of Castile. Finally, John of Gaunt was an important character in William Shakespeare's play about his nephew, Richard II, which was adapted in 2012's The Hollow Crown. The Hollow Crown is a series of TV film adaptations of Shakespeare's history plays, starting with Richard II, Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, and Henry V in 2012, and concluding with Henry VI, Parts 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III in 2016. Spanning 87 years of English history, the complete series of The Hollow Crown features 8 monarchs, the most in the greater HCU. They are Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, Edward IV, Edward V, Richard III, and Henry VII. 2003's Henry VIII features every Tudor monarch: Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. However, it does not feature every English monarch of that time. For that, we go to Elizabeth R. from 1971, which features Edward VI, the disputed Lady Jane Grey, Mary I, her husband and co-regent Philip, the future King Philip of Spain, and finally, Elizabeth I. Gunpowder, Treason, and Plot is a 2-part historical drama from 2004 focusing on the reigns of the Scottish monarchs, Mary, Queen of the Scots, and her son, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. The show features Elizabeth I, James I, and the future Charles I. The 1970 feature film Cromwell is about the life of Oliver Cromwell, who fought against Charles I in the English Civil War and became Lord Protector of England. The movie has Charles I, the Lord Protectors, Oliver Cromwell, and his son Richard Cromwell, and the future Charles II. The First Churchills is a 1969 serial from the BBC about the lives of John and Sarah Churchill, and features Charles II, James II, Mary II, William III, and Queen Anne. And here we have our second break in the Greater Crown, as I have not found any stories featuring Queen Anne and George I. Fortunately, we have a direct connection through James Stuart, son of James II, who was removed from the line of succession and spent the rest of his life fighting to reclaim the throne his father lost. His supporters were known as the Jacobites. In the First Churchills, we see a young James Stuart exiled in France. James Stuart also appears in The Iron Glove, a 1954 historical adventure film loosely based on the life of Jacobite Charles Wogan, which also features George I. Saraband for Dead Lovers is a 1948 British historical drama about a doomed love affair between a Swedish count and Sophia Dorothea, wife to the future George I. It features not only the future George I, but also the future George II. Aristocrats is a British miniseries from 1999 about the lives of 4 sisters from an aristocratic family in the 18th century. It features George II and the future George III. Prince Regent is a 1979 British series about the life and reign of George IV. It features George III, George IV, and William IV. Victoria and Albert is a 2-part series from 2001 that focuses on the marriage of Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert. It features William IV, Queen Victoria, and the future Edward VII. Edward VII is a 1979 series about King Edward VII and features Queen Victoria, Edward VII, and the future kings George V, Edward VIII, and George VI. The Crown, the Netflix series about the life and reign of Elizabeth II from 1947 to 2005, features George V in a flashback, Edward VIII, George VI, Elizabeth II, and the future Charles III, the current British monarch. The Crown also features the current heir apparent to the British throne, William, Prince of Wales. Harry and Meghan, Escaping the Palace, from 2021, is the third film in a trilogy of Lifetime original movies about Prince Harry and Meghan, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. For a time, this was the last story in the greater HCU. It features Elizabeth II, Charles III, Prince William, and Prince George of Wales, William's firstborn child and second in line to the throne. And there you have it, nearly 50 monarchs, including disputed and future ones, across over 900 years of history in just over 20 stories. This doesn't even include the other 200 plus stories that are part of the Greater Crown. And because all these stories can be viewed as part of a single narrative arc spanning centuries, I consider the Greater Crown to be the central line of the greater historical cinematic universe. It can also be used as shorthand to highlight how a story connects to all the other stories in the greater historical cinematic universe, since every story within the GHCU will connect to the Greater Crown in varying degrees of separation. And I will show these connections in future videos, so please subscribe so you don't miss out. Before I go, I would like to give a huge shout out to Marie's Monarchy Marathon, another YouTube channel that also posts videos about movies and shows based on history. Thanks to one of her videos, I discovered a mistake I made in the greater historical cinematic universe. When you look at the full cast and crew page for Aristocrats on IMDb, you see that the character that's based on the future King George III is identified only as Prince of Wales. Normally, figuring out who is the Prince of Wales would be easy, since English and British monarchs typically only have one Prince of Wales, but King George II had two. The first was his son Frederick, who died in 1751, and the second was Frederick's son, George, who of course went on to become King George III. If you watched Aristocrats, it is obvious that the Prince of Wales character is meant to be George. However, I did not watch Aristocrats when I initially added it to the GHCU, and mistakenly listed Frederick instead. Fortunately, Marie does watch the films and shows she covers on her channel, and so in her video on the House of Hanover, she correctly identified the Prince of Wales as the future King George III, and I was able to correct my mistake. Thanks, Marie. If you haven't already, please check out her channel. The link is in the description. That's all for now. If you like this video, please leave a like. If there are any movies and shows you'd like to see me cover, please comment below. And if you want to see more of these videos, please subscribe. I can promise you that the next video is going to be a blast.